the small town of Springfield had always been a quiet place where neighbors knew each other by name, and doors were left unlocked even after the sun dipped below the horizon. It was the kind of community where the most scandalous news was usually a dispute over a property line, or a stray dog digging up a prize-winning garden. However, in the late autumn of 1968, a shadow fell over the sleepy town that would forever alter its history and the memories of those who lived there. The events centered around a modest 2-story Victorian home on the outskirts of town, a structure that had stood vacant for nearly a decade before the arrival of the Harrow family. Locals whispered that the soil beneath the house was sour, but few could have predicted the sheer terror that was about to unfold within those peeling white walls. James and Elaine Harrow were a young couple looking for a fresh start away from the bustling noise of the city, and they believed they had found their sanctuary in Springfield. They brought with them their 6-year-old daughter, Rose, a bright and cheerful child who loved to chase butterflies in the overgrown garden that surrounded their new property. The house required significant work, but James was a handyman by trade and saw only potential in the creaking floorboards and drafty windows. Elaine spent her days cleaning layers of dust that had settled over the years, while Rose played in the spacious attic that offered a view of the dense woods bordering the back of the lot. For the first few weeks, life seemed idyllic, and the family settled into a routine that felt both comforting and permanent. The first sign that something was amiss came not with a loud crash or a terrifying scream, but with a subtle shift in the atmosphere that was felt more than seen. Elaine began to notice that the temperature in the house would plummet unexpectedly, even when the furnace was roaring in the basement. She would walk into the kitchen to prepare breakfast, and her breath would mist in the air, as if she had stepped into a walk-in freezer. James dismissed these occurrences as the result of poor insulation and old drafty windows, promising to seal the gaps before winter fully set in. But the cold was distinct and localized, often hovering in the hallway outside the bedroom of young Rose. It was a cold that seemed to penetrate the skin and settle deep within the bones, leaving a feeling of profound unease. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the activity within the house began to escalate beyond simple drafts and creaking timbers. Rose began to speak of a new friend she had made in the house, a shy playmate who preferred to hide in the shadows of the attic. At first, James and Elaine assumed this was nothing more than the active imagination of a lonely child adjusting to a new environment. Rose called her friend Mr. Scratch, a name that sent a shiver down Elaine's spine, though she tried to hide her concern from her daughter. Rose would spend hours talking to the empty corner of her room, her voice hushed and conspiratorial, as if sharing secrets that were not meant for adult ears. The parents tried to be supportive, but the look in Rose's eyes when she spoke of him was disturbingly intense. One evening, while James was repairing a loose step on the front porch, he heard a heavy thud come from the floor above, followed by the sound of dragging. He dropped his tools and raced up the stairs, fearing that Rose had fallen or hurt herself in some way. When he burst into her room, he found her sitting calmly in the center of the floor, surrounded by her dolls, which had been arranged in a perfect circle facing outward. The heavy oak wardrobe that stood against the far wall had been shifted several inches to the left, leaving deep gouges in the hardwood floor. When James asked her what had happened, Rose simply pointed to the empty corner and whispered that Mr. Scratch was angry because he did not like the cross that Elaine had hung over the door frame. Sleep became a luxury that the Harrow family could no longer afford, as the noises at night grew louder and more aggressive. It started with rhythmic knocking on the walls in sets of 3, a mocking sound that echoed through the silent hallways at exactly 3 in the morning. James would arm himself with a flashlight and prowl the house looking for the source of the disturbance, but he never found a cause. The knocking would move from room to room, seemingly anticipating his movements, and ceasing the moment he approached a specific wall. Elaine began to suffer from vivid nightmares where she was trapped in the house as it burned her lungs, filling with smoke, while a dark figure watched her from the doorway, laughing, a low guttural sound that she could hear even after waking. The situation reached a breaking point when physical marks began to appear on the body of young Rose without any logical explanation. Elaine was bathing her daughter one evening when she noticed 3 long red scratches running down the length of the child back. The marks were inflamed and warm to the touch, looking as though they had been inflicted by a large animal with sharp claws. Rose did not cry or complain of pain, but merely stated that Mr. Scratch had tried to hold her too tight because he did not want her to leave the room. James was horrified and immediately took Rose to the local doctor, who could find no medical cause for the injuries, and looked at the parents with a mixture of suspicion and pity, desperate for answers and fearing for the safety of their daughter James. And Elaine turned to the only institution they felt could help them in their time of need. They visited the rectory of St. Mary Catholic Church and spoke with Father Thomas Bennett, a seasoned priest who had served the Springfield community for over 40 years. Father Bennett was a man of logic and reason, who usually sought psychological or scientific explanations for the troubles of his parishioners. However, as he listened to the trembling voices of the Harrow parents and saw the terror etched into their faces, he felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He agreed to visit the home the following evening to perform a simple blessing, hoping to put their minds at ease. When Father Bennett arrived at the Harrow residence. The sun had already set, and the house loomed against the darkening sky like a sentient beast waiting for its prey. The air inside felt heavy and oppressive, carrying a faint scent of sulfur and rotting meat that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The priest donned his stole and retrieved a vial of holy water from his satchel, beginning the prayers of blessing in a steady and commanding voice. As he moved from room to room, sprinkling the water and reciting Latin verses, the house seemed to react with hostility. The lights flickered violently, and the temperature dropped so low that frost began to form on the inside of the window panes, creating intricate patterns of ice. The ritual came to a sudden halt when Father Bennett entered the bedroom of young Rose, where the atmosphere was thick with a palpable malevolence. Rose was sitting on her bed, her head bowed low. But as the priest stepped across the threshold, she slowly lifted her gaze. Her eyes, which had always been a bright and innocent blue, were now dark and dilated, appearing almost entirely black in the dim light. She opened her mouth to speak, but the voice that emerged was not that of a 6-year-old girl. It was a deep, raspy growl that sounded like grinding stones, and it spoke to the priest in fluent Latin, a language the child had never learned. The voice mocked Father Bennett, calling him by a childhood nickname that no one in Springfield knew. Father Bennett stumbled back, clutching his rosary, as the realization of what he was facing crashed down upon him with terrifying weight. This was not a simple case of an overactive imagination or a settling house, but a genuine demonic infestation of a high order. He ordered James and Elaine to take Rose downstairs and wait in the living room while he attempted to secure the perimeter of the bedroom. As the parents rushed to obey, the door to the bedroom slammed shut with tremendous force, locking the priest inside with the entity. For 10 agonizing minutes, James and Elaine heard the sounds of a violent struggle emanating from the room above, accompanied by the priest shouting prayers of deliverance. When the door finally unlocked and Father Bennett emerged, he looked as though he had aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. His face was pale and covered in a sheen of cold sweat, and his hands trembled uncontrollably as he packed his religious items. He told the terrified parents that he could not handle this alone, and that he needed to contact the bishop immediately to request permission for a major exorcism. He explained that the entity attached to Rose was ancient and powerful, and that it had laid claim to the house long before the Harrow family had arrived. He warned them not to engage with the entity and to keep a constant vigil over Rose until he could return with help. The approval from the bishop took 3 agonizing days to arrive, days in which the Harrow family lived in a state of perpetual siege. During this time, the activity in the house became brazen and physically dangerous, with objects flying across rooms and furniture stacking itself in impossible configurations. Rose withdrew completely into herself, refusing to eat or sleep sitting in a catatonic state, while the entity used her voice to whisper obscenities and threats. James and Elaine took turns watching her, terrified that if they looked away for even a second, she would be taken from them forever. They boarded up the windows and covered the mirrors, trying to block out the darkness that seemed to be encroaching from every side. Father Bennett returned on a stormy Tuesday night, accompanied by a younger priest named Father Michael, who had been assigned to assist him in the ritual. They brought with them the Roman Ritual, a book of ancient prayers and instructions for casting out demons, as well as relics of saints and blessed salt. The mood was somber as they set up a makeshift altar in the living room, deciding it was safer to perform the exorcism on the ground floor, where there was more space. James and Elaine were instructed to hold Rose down if she became violent, but to otherwise remain silent and pray with all their hearts. The rain lashed against the windows like 1,000 tiny hammers, setting a grim cadence for the night ahead. The exorcism began with the litany of the saints, the priests calling upon holy figures to aid them in the battle for the soul of the innocent child. As the first names were invoked, Rose's body went rigid, and she let out a scream that sounded like the tearing of metal. She began to thrash violently against the grip of her father, displaying a level of physical strength that was impossible for a child of her size. Her muscles bulged, and her bones cracked audibly as her body contorted into unnatural positions. Father Bennett pressed a crucifix against her forehead, commanding the spirit to reveal its name and to depart from the vessel it had invaded. The response from the entity was immediate and terrifying, as the room was suddenly plunged into absolute darkness when the light bulbs shattered simultaneously. The only illumination came from the flickering candles on the altar, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to take on lives of their own. A wind whipped through the closed room, sending papers flying and extinguishing the candles one by one, until Father Michael managed to relight them with shaking hands. The entity laughed, a sound that seemed to come from every corner of the room, at once mocking the priest's attempts to banish it. It began to reveal the sins of everyone present, speaking of secret regrets and hidden shames that they had never voiced to another living soul. Father Bennett remained steadfast, his voice rising above the din of the chaos, as he continued the prayers of the ritual with unwavering conviction. He knew that the entity was trying to break their will, to use their own fears and insecurities against them, to stop the exorcism. He focused his eyes on the crucifix in his hand, refusing to look at the twisted visage of the child, who was currently snarling at him like a wild beast. He splashed holy water onto Rose's face, which sizzled and steamed upon contact, as if it were acid burning the skin of the demon hiding beneath. The entity howled in pain and rage, threatening to tear the house down around them if the priest did not cease his torment. As the night wore on, the physical manifestations of the haunting became more intense and harder for the human mind to comprehend. At one point, the heavy oak coffee table levitated several feet into the air and hovered there for a moment before being hurled across the room, smashing into the wall. Deep cracks began to appear in the plaster of the ceiling, and a dark viscous liquid started to ooze from the fissures, dripping onto the carpet below. The smell in the room became unbearable, a mixture of sulfur-rotting flesh and burning hair that made everyone gag and struggle for breath. Father Michael faltered for a moment, overcome by the sensory assault. But Father Bennett grabbed his arm and urged him to continue. The battle of wills continued for hours, with neither side willing to yield ground in the spiritual warfare that was consuming the living room. Rose's face was unrecognizable, her features distorted by the evil presence that was fighting to maintain its hold on her. She began to speak in tongues, a cacophony of ancient languages that had not been spoken on earth for centuries, weaving a spell of confusion and despair. The priests countered with the psalms, reciting verses of protection and deliverance, trying to cut through the noise and reach the child buried deep within. James and Elaine wept openly, their hearts breaking, as they watched their beloved daughter serve as the battlefield for this cosmic struggle. Just before dawn, the entity played its final and most desperate card in an attempt to stop the exorcism once and for all. Rose's body arched off the couch, levitating into the air. Without any support, her eyes rolling back into her head until only the whites were visible. She turned her head a full 180 degrees, a physical impossibility that caused Elaine to scream and bury her face in her husband's chest. The entity spoke one final time, its voice booming with a power that shook the foundation of the house, declaring that it would never leave. Then, with a deafening crack that sounded like a gunshot, Rose's body fell back onto the couch and lay perfectly still. Silence descended upon the room, a heavy and suffocating silence that was more terrifying than the noise that had preceded it. Father Bennett slowly approached the child, checking for a pulse and looking for any sign of life in her small, battered frame. For a terrifying moment, there was no movement, and the parents feared the worst, believing that the strain had been too much for her heart. Then Rose took a deep, gasping breath, and her eyes fluttered open, revealing the clear blue irises that belonged to her and her alone. She looked around the room with confusion, asking simply why it was so dark and why her parents were crying. The exhaustion that followed the exorcism was absolute, leaving everyone in the room physically and emotionally drained beyond measure. James and Elaine held their daughter close, refusing to let go, as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the boarded windows. Father Bennett and Father Michael slumped against the wall, their vestments stained with sweat and the dark fluid that had dripped from the ceiling. They offered a prayer of thanksgiving, but their voices were weak and hoarse from hours of shouting. The house felt different now. The oppressive weight had lifted, leaving behind only the mundane quiet of a dusty old building. The Harrow family did not stay in the house for another night, packing only their most essential belongings and leaving Springfield that very morning. They moved across the state to a small apartment where they hoped to rebuild their lives and forget the horrors they had witnessed. James and Elaine never spoke of the events to anyone, fearing that they would be labeled as insane, or that speaking of it might invite the darkness back. Rose grew up with no memory of the weeks she spent under the control of the entity, remembering only a long bad dream where she was trapped in a cold, dark box. Father Bennett never fully recovered from the ordeal of the Springfield Exorcism and retired from active ministry less than a year later. The strain of the night had taken a toll on his heart, and he spent his remaining years in a quiet monastery praying for those who were afflicted by evil. He wrote a detailed report of the event for the church archives, but requested that it be sealed until 50 years after his death. He often told the younger monks that there are doors in this world that should never be opened, and that some houses are born bad, just as some men are. The house on the outskirts of Springfield stood empty. For decades, its reputation as a cursed place, keeping potential buyers and curious locals at bay. The windows remained boarded up, and the garden grew wild and tangled, reclaiming the land that the Harrow family had briefly tried to tame. Stories began to circulate among the teenagers of the town, who would dare each other to run up to the porch and touch the front door. They claimed that if you pressed your ear against the wood late at night, you could still hear the sound of a child weeping and a low, guttural voice whispering in a language no one could understand. In the early 1980s, a developer purchased the land with the intention of tearing down the old Victorian home to build a modern subdivision. The demolition crew arrived on a bright summer morning with bulldozers and wrecking balls, ready to erase the dark history of the site. However, as the first machine struck the side of the house, the engine seized and died with a mechanical screech. Workers reported feeling sudden waves of nausea and dizziness when they approached the foundation, and tools would vanish only to reappear in dangerous locations. After 3 days of accidents and equipment failures, the crew refused to work on the site, and the developer was forced to abandon the project. The town of Springfield tried its best to forget the house and the legend of the exorcism, pushing the memories into the dark corners of local history. But the house remained a rotting monument to the fear that had once gripped the community, a scar that refused to heal. On quiet nights, when the wind blew from the north, the older residents would close their windows and turn up their radios, trying to drown out the sounds they imagined were carried on the breeze. They knew that, while the Harrow family had escaped the darkness that lived in that house, had not been destroyed, merely dormant. Paranormal investigators and thrill seekers occasionally visited the town, drawn by the rumors of the Springfield Exorcism and the house that defied demolition. They would set up their cameras and audio recorders, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural, to prove that the stories were true. Most left with nothing but feelings of unease and corrupted data files. But a few claimed to have captured chilling electronic voice phenomena. The recordings always contained the same message, a rasping voice demanding that they leave, followed by the sound of a child laughing in the distance. The legend of the Springfield Exorcism became a cautionary tale passed down through generations, a warning that some evils are older and stronger than we can comprehend. It served as a reminder that the line between our world and the next is thinner than we like to believe, and that there are things lurking in the shadows that hunger for our light. The house still stands today, its roof sagging, and its paint gone, watching the town with hollow eyes. It waits patiently for the next family who might be foolish enough to see potential in its rotting frame. As the years turn into decades, the truth of what happened in that house becomes blurred with fiction, creating a mythology that is uniquely American. But for those who were there, for the priest who lost his health, and the parents who lost their innocence, the terror was all too real. They learned that safety is an illusion, and that evil does not need an invitation to enter our lives. It simply needs an opening. And in the dark, quiet hours of the night, when the world is asleep, the entity in the house on the edge of town is still awake, listening and waiting. The modern era has brought new skepticism to the story, with internet sleuths trying to debunk the events as mass hysteria or undiagnosed mental illness. They analyze the old reports and point out inconsistencies, claiming that science can explain away the impossible. Yet none of them are willing to spend a night alone in the house to test their theories. The fear that permeates the soil around the property is primal and instinctive, bypassing logic and striking directly at the reptile brain. It is a fear that says run, a fear that says do not look back. There are those in Springfield who say that on the anniversary of the exorcism, you can see a strange light flickering in the window of what was once Rose's bedroom. It is not the warm glow of a candle or the harsh beam of a flashlight, but a cold blue luminescence that seems to pulsate like a heartbeat. The local police receive calls every year about intruders in the old house. But when they arrive, they find the doors locked and the dust undisturbed. They write it off as a trick of the light or a reflection from passing cars. But they never linger on the property longer than necessary. The psychological impact on the community was profound, changing the way the townspeople viewed their world and their place within it. Attendance at St. Mary Church skyrocketed in the months following the exorcism, as people sought protection from forces they could not control. Neighbors became more suspicious of one another, looking for signs of possession or witchcraft in the most mundane behaviors. The innocence of the small town was replaced by a wary vigilance that would persist for years. They had looked into the abyss, and they knew that the abyss was looking back. Even today, the name Harrow is spoken in hushed tones in the coffee shops and barber shops of Springfield, a synonym for tragedy and terror. The few people still alive who remember the family speak of them with a mixture of pity and respect for surviving the ordeal. They remember a polite couple and a sweet little girl who were chewed up and spit out by a darkness they did not create. They wonder where Rose is now, if she is still alive, and if she still carries the scars of that long, terrible night on her soul. The enduring legacy of the Springfield Exorcism is not the house itself or the stories told around campfires, but the lingering question it planted in the minds of the locals. It forces them to ask what lies beneath the surface of their quiet lives, what monsters might be sleeping in the earth beneath their feet. It challenges the comfort of their daily reality, suggesting that we are never truly safe, that the walls we build are paper thin. It is a story that refuses to die because it touches on our deepest and most ancient fear, the fear of the unknown. As you drive past the outskirts of Springfield today, you might miss the overgrown driveway that leads to the house, hidden behind a wall of trees. Nature has done its best to swallow the structure, to hide the evidence of the evil that resides there from the eyes of the world. But if you stop your car and roll down the window, you can feel the drop in temperature and the heaviness in the air. You can feel the eyes of the house upon you, watching and assessing, wondering if you are the one who will finally unlock the door. The story of the Springfield Exorcism serves as a grim reminder that not every ghost story has a happy ending or a clear resolution. Sometimes the entity wins simply by surviving, by outlasting those who tried to banish it. The victory of Father Bennett was temporary, a fleeting moment of relief in a war that has no end. The evil remains patient and eternal, bound to the land, and the timbers of the house waiting for the cycle to begin again. It is a local community fear that has become a permanent part of the landscape. So if you ever find yourself in Springfield and you see a listing for a historic Victorian home at a price that seems too good to be true, keep driving. Do not let the charm of the architecture or the promise of a quiet life lure you into the trap that has been set. remember the Harrow family and the price they paid for their dream home, and heed the warning that the town whispers to the wind. Some doors are meant to remain closed, and some houses are not meant for the living. The darkness that dwells in Springfield is not unique, for every town has its secrets and its shadows that stretch long in the evening light. But the intensity of what happened in 1968 set it apart, creating a focal point for supernatural energy that continues to draw attention. It is a black mark on the map, a coordinate of fear that pulses with a dark rhythm. And as long as the house stands, the story will continue written in the cold drafts and the creaking floorboards of a home that hates. Ultimately, the Springfield Exorcism is more than just a ghost story. It is a testament to the fragility of the human spirit and the power of faith. It shows us that even in the face of absolute terror, there is the capacity for courage and sacrifice. But it also teaches us that courage is not always enough, that sometimes the darkness is too deep to be fully conquered. It leaves us with the chilling thought that while we may walk in the light, there are always shadows waiting just beyond the reach of our vision.